In today's heartbreaking episode, you will learn the story of a successful lawyer and husband who became involved in gay affairs, and it ended in a brutal, treacherous murder. The case begins in early 2023. Thomas Hargrove, a 42-year-old corporate lawyer, had built a reputation for himself as a dedicated professional with an impeccable track record. His wife, Margaret Maggie Hargrove, was 38, an elegant woman who had once been a respected journalist, but had given up her career to focus on raising their two children, Grace and Michael, now teenagers. Maggie was known for her sharp wit and keen intelligence, which had made her a formidable figure in her previous profession. With her striking blonde hair and a smile that charmed anyone she met, Maggie was the perfect complement to Thomas. Together, they seemed like the perfect couple, successful, attractive, and well-respected in their community. But by the beginning of our story, everything began to be not so smooth. Their marriage, now in its 18th year, had grown distant and cold. Thomas's work demanded long hours, leaving Maggie alone at home to deal with the pressures of raising their children and managing the household. Their conversations had become strained, and the warmth that once defined their relationship had all but vanished. Maggie had noticed a change in Thomas over the past year, a subtle shift in his behavior that she couldn't quite put her finger on. In late 2023, as the world was slowly emerging from a period of global uncertainty, the Hargroves' lives were about to take a turn that no one could have anticipated. What seemed like minor marital issues would soon unravel into a dark and twisted tale of betrayal, secrets, and murder. It was during a routine business trip to New York City in late 2023 that Thomas's life took an unexpected turn. The trip was supposed to be like any other, a series of meetings, client dinners, and long hours spent in hotel rooms preparing for the next day. But on this particular trip, Thomas decided it was there that he met Daniel Green. Unbeknownst to Maggie, her husband had been living a double life. With his hard, stressful work, his nervous system began to fail, and he began to notice in himself that something was wrong with his needs. He started to look at men, especially those younger than him. Daniel was 35, a successful architect who had recently moved to New York from Los Angeles. With his tousled brown hair, sharp jawline, and piercing green eyes, Daniel was the kind of man who turned heads. But it wasn't just his looks that drew people in. It was his charisma, his easygoing nature, and the way he could make anyone feel at ease in his presence. That night, Thomas and Daniel struck up a conversation at the bar, initially talking about work, the pressures of their respective careers, and the challenges of balancing their professional and personal lives. What started as a casual conversation quickly deepened as the two men found themselves sharing more personal details. Thomas, who had always been cautious about revealing too much about his personal life, found himself opening up to Daniel in a way he hadn't with anyone else in years. There was something about Daniel that made him feel understood, something that drew him in and made him want to know more. As the night wore on, and the drinks kept flowing, the conversation took an unexpected turn. Daniel, sensing the connection between them, leaned in closer and made a comment that was both bold and revealing. He told Thomas that he had never felt such an instant chemistry with someone before, and that he could sense that Thomas was struggling with something deeper than just work stress. The comment took Thomas by surprise, but instead of pulling back, he found himself drawn in even more. The two men shared a long, charged look, and in that moment, something inside Thomas shifted. By the time they reached Daniel's apartment, it was clear where the night was headed. Thomas, who had never before acted on any impulses outside his marriage, found himself caught up in a whirlwind of emotions: excitement, fear, desire, and guilt all mingled together. But in that moment, he pushed the guilt aside and allowed himself to give in to the connection he felt with Daniel. Thomas and Daniel would meet whenever they could: business trips, weekend getaways, stolen afternoons in the city. The secrecy of their meetings only heightened the intensity of their relationship. But the more time Thomas spent with Daniel, the more difficult it became to return to his life with Maggie. The disconnect between his life at home and his life with Daniel was growing, and Thomas was starting to feel the strain. Unbeknownst to Thomas, his affair was not as well hidden as he believed. Maggie, always perceptive, had begun to notice subtle changes in her husband's behavior. He was more distant, more distracted, and there were times when she couldn't reach him during his trips. But for now, she had no concrete proof, only a growing suspicion that something was very wrong. Maggie Hargrove had always been a woman with an eye for detail, a skill that had served her well during her years as a journalist. But in her personal life, she had tried to push aside the nagging feeling that something was amiss in her marriage. She had attributed Thomas's recent distance to the pressures of his demanding job and the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. However, as the months wore on, the signs became harder to ignore. At first, it was the small things that caught her attention. The way Thomas would suddenly have to take a call in another room, the vague answers he gave when she asked about his day, the frequent trips that seemed to have no clear purpose. There was also the change in his demeanor when he returned from these trips. He was often distracted, and there was a restlessness about him that Maggie couldn't quite place. It was as if he was carrying a secret, something that weighed heavily on him even when he tried to act as if everything was normal. Maggie's suspicions grew when she found herself alone one evening, with Thomas away on yet another business trip. She had decided to clean out their home office, something she hadn't done in a while. As she sorted through papers and files, she came across something that made her heart skip a beat. A receipt from a high-end hotel in New York City, dated during a time when Thomas had told her he was in Boston. The receipt wasn't just for a room. It also included charges for room service for two. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Why would Thomas lie about where he was staying? Who had he been with? The question swirled in her mind, but she knew she needed more than just a receipt to confront him. The possibility that Thomas was having an affair gnawed at her, but she needed to be sure before she acted. She checked his phone bills, credit card statements, and even his emails, looking for anything that could confirm her suspicions. It was a painful process, but Maggie was determined to uncover the truth. Her efforts were rewarded when she stumbled upon an email account she didn't recognize, hidden among Thomas's work emails. It was a personal account that he had never mentioned to her, and it was linked to a series of messages that left no doubt in her mind about what was happening. The emails were exchanged between Thomas and someone named Daniel Green. They were filled with intimate conversations, plans to meet, and expressions of affection that made Maggie's blood run cold. The emails revealed the depth of the relationship between Thomas and Daniel. This wasn't just a fling. It was a full-blown affair. Maggie read through the messages with a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak, feeling as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. Her husband, the man she had loved and built a life with, was not who she thought he was. The realization that Thomas was involved with another man added another layer of shock and betrayal to what she was already feeling. In the correspondence, she saw intimate photographs of a muscular, handsome man, which were kept in her husband's work email. After days of emotional turmoil, Maggie decided to confront Thomas. But she knew she needed to approach the situation carefully. She wasn't just angry. She was hurt, confused, and desperate to understand how their marriage had come to this point. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Maggie sat down with Thomas in their living room. Her hands trembled as she held the printed emails in her lap, waiting for the right moment to bring them up. "Thomas," she began, her voice steady but laced with tension, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Have you been seeing someone else?" Thomas looked at her, his expression betraying nothing at first. But when Maggie pulled out the printed emails and placed them on the coffee table between them, his face drained of color. He reached for the papers with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the incriminating messages. "Maggie," he started, but she cut him off, her voice now tinged with anger. Don't lie to me anymore, Thomas. I know everything. I know about Daniel." Thomas sat back, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had just crashed down on him. He was silent for a long moment, unable to meet Maggie's gaze. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted you to find out like this. I didn't want to hurt you." Maggie's emotions surged, anger, betrayal, sadness, all crashing together in a storm she could barely contain. Thomas struggled to find the words to explain himself. He had known this moment might come, but he had never prepared for the reality of it. He tried to tell Maggie that he hadn't meant for any of this to happen, that his feelings for Daniel had caught him off guard, that he still cared about her and the family they had built. But Maggie wasn't interested in his explanations. To her, it felt like nothing more than excuses. "I want this to end," she said firmly, her voice cold and irresolute. "I want you to stop seeing him. If you care about this family at all, you'll end it." Thomas nodded, knowing that he had no choice. He promised Maggie that he would end the affair, that he would do whatever it took to repair the damage he had caused. But as they sat there in silence, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. The trust between them had been shattered, and no matter what Thomas said, the image of him with another man was burned into her mind. That night, Maggie lay awake, staring at the ceiling as her thoughts raced. She had confronted Thomas, but the sense of betrayal was overwhelming, and the reality of what he had done was too much to bear. She wondered if their marriage could ever recover from this, or if the love they once had was gone forever. Despite Thomas's promises, Maggie couldn't shake the fear that he might not truly end things with Daniel. She decided to take matters into her own hands, determined to protect her family from further harm. She began researching Daniel, learning everything she could about the man who had come between her and her husband. She found his social media profiles, tracked down his home address, and even went as far as to drive by his apartment in the city, watching from a distance as she tried to piece together who he was and why Thomas had been drawn to him. Ending his affair with Daniel was not as simple as he had hoped. The relationship had become deeply entwined with his emotions and identity, and cutting ties with Daniel proved to be an agonizing decision. After his confrontation with Maggie, Thomas reluctantly called Daniel and told him that they needed to end things. The conversation was tense and filled with emotion. Thomas tried to explain that his marriage and family had to come first, and that he couldn't continue living this double life. Daniel, who had grown attached to Thomas, was devastated. The pain in his voice was palpable as he pleaded with Thomas to reconsider. "Thomas, you don't have to choose between us," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "We can find a way to make this work. You don't have to give up what we have." But Thomas was firm, though his resolve wavered as he heard the anguish in Daniel's words. "I can't keep doing this, Daniel. It's tearing my family apart. I have to stop before it's too late." For a few days after that call, there was silence. Thomas tried to focus on repairing his marriage, though the emotional chasm between him and Maggie was wider than ever. He threw himself into his work, hoping that the distance from both Maggie and Daniel would allow him to sort through his feelings. But the quiet didn't last long. One evening, Thomas received a text from Daniel, asking to meet one last time. Daniel claimed he needed closure, that he couldn't move on without a final conversation. Against his better judgment, Thomas agreed, driven by a mix of guilt and lingering affection. They met at a small coffee shop in the city, away from the usual spots they frequented together. When Thomas arrived, Daniel looked different, more fragile, as though he had been struggling deeply since their breakup. They sat in a corner booth, away from prying eyes. Daniel's initial demeanor was calm, but it soon became clear that he wasn't ready to let go. "I can't just pretend like this never happened, Thomas," Daniel said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You can't just walk away from everything we shared." Thomas sighed, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I know this is hard, but we have to move on. Maggie knows about us, and I can't risk losing my family." "I'm sorry, Daniel." But Daniel wasn't ready to give up. His tone shifted, becoming more intense, more desperate. "Do you really think Maggie will ever forgive you? She'll never trust you again, Thomas. You can try to patch things up, but deep down, she'll always know who you really are. She'll resent you for it, and eventually, it'll destroy you both." Thomas flinched at Daniel's words, the truth in them cutting deep. He had already considered the possibility that his marriage was beyond repair, that Maggie might never be able to truly forgive him. But hearing Daniel voice these fears made them all the more real. Seeing the doubt flicker in Thomas's eyes, Daniel pressed on. "You don't have to live a lie, Thomas. You don't have to pretend to be someone you're not just to keep up appearances. What we have is real. You can't just turn your back on that. Thomas felt torn, the conflict within him growing stronger. Part of him wanted to believe that he could still salvage his marriage, that he could find a way to make things right with Maggie. But another part of him, the part that had found comfort, excitement, and connection with Daniel, couldn't help but question whether he was making the right choice. Sensing Thomas's hesitation, Daniel leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Maggie doesn't understand you, not like I do. She'll never accept who you really are. You're going to end up miserable, trapped in a life that's a lie. But with me, you can be yourself. We can be happy, Thomas. You just have to let go of the past. Over the next few days, Daniel's words began to take root in Thomas's mind. He found himself questioning everything: his marriage, his choices, his identity. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Daniel might be right. The cracks in his marriage were too deep to be repaired, and even if he and Maggie stayed together, things would never be the same. But Maggie wasn't oblivious to what was happening. She noticed the way Thomas seemed more withdrawn, more conflicted, despite his attempts to reassure her that the affair was over. She could see the internal struggle he was facing, and it scared her. She knew that Daniel wasn't going to disappear quietly, and she feared that Thomas might still be in contact with him. Maggie's fear turned into action. She decided to confront Daniel directly, to make it clear that he needed to stay away from her husband. She found his address in the city and drove there one evening, determined to put an end to the situation once and for all. When she arrived at Daniel's apartment, she was filled with a mixture of anger and fear, but she knew she had to do this. Daniel was surprised to see Maggie at his door, but he quickly composed himself, inviting her inside with a calm demeanor that belied the tension between them. Maggie wasted no time in getting to the point. "You need to stay away from Thomas," she said, her voice firm. "This affair is over. He's chosen his family, and you need to respect that." Daniel's expression remained neutral, but there was a hint of something darker in his eyes. "And what makes you think he'll stay with you?" he asked quietly. "You think you can just force him to forget about everything we've been through?" Maggie's anger flared. "He's my husband, and we have a family. Whatever you think you had with him, it's over. You need to move on." But Daniel wasn't backing down. He took a step closer to Maggie, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You don't get it, do you? Thomas doesn't love you anymore. You're just a reminder of the life he's trying to escape. He'll come back to me, Maggie. And when he does, there's nothing you can do to stop it." The confrontation left Maggie shaken, but more determined than ever. She realized that Daniel wasn't just a threat to her marriage. He was a threat to her entire life. The encounter had escalated the situation, and she knew that she had to take drastic measures to protect her family. But she couldn't have known just how far things would spiral out of control, or how deadly the situation would become. Daniel, emboldened by his confrontation with Maggie, began to play a more dangerous game. He reached out to Thomas again, sending messages that hinted at the confrontation with Maggie, trying to drive a wedge deeper between them. He played on Thomas's doubts and insecurities, planting seeds of mistrust and resentment. Daniel's goal was clear: to push Thomas to the breaking point, to make him choose between his old life and the new one Daniel was offering. After a particularly heated argument with Maggie one evening, Thomas stormed out of the house. He didn't tell her where he was going, but Maggie didn't need to ask. She knew he was going to see Daniel. Her heart sank as she watched him drive away, the fear of what might happen next gnawing at her insides. She considered following him but decided against it, hoping instead that Thomas might finally find the strength to end things with Daniel for good. Thomas drove to Daniel's apartment in the city, his emotions in turmoil. He was determined to put an end to the affair once and for all, hoping that this final confrontation would bring him some measure of peace. But when he arrived at Daniel's building, a sense of dread settled over him. The place was eerily quiet, the usual hustle and bustle of city life muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Thomas knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time, his anxiety growing with each passing second. Still nothing. The silence was deafening. After a few moments of hesitation, he tried the door handle, surprised to find it unlocked. Cautiously, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of a lamp in the corner. The air was heavy, thick with an unsettling stillness. Thomas called out for Daniel, but there was no response. As he moved further into the apartment, his heart began to race, the fear that something was terribly wrong gnawing at him. Then he saw it. Daniel's body lay on the floor in the living room, motionless. His skin was pale, his eyes staring lifelessly at the ceiling. Blood pooled around him, staining the carpet in a dark, foreboding red. The scene was grotesque, a stark contrast to the calm, intimate moments they had once shared in this very room. Thomas froze, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. It was as if time itself had stopped. The horrific image burned into his brain. Daniel was dead. His body bore the unmistakable signs of violence. Everything was covered in blood. And when Thomas turned denial over, he saw many stab wounds. It was uncountable. Thomas was the first person Moore interviewed. Sitting in a small, dimly lit interrogation room at the police station, Thomas was visibly shaken, his hands still trembling. His eyes were red and bloodshot, his face pale and drawn. He struggled to answer Moore's questions, his voice shaky and his thoughts disjointed. He recounted his arrival at the apartment, the horror of finding Daniel dead, and his frantic call to the police. He also said that his wife had quarrels with Daniel. He admitted that he was his lover and his wife was very angry about it, but she could not kill him. Forensics teams scoured Daniel's apartment, collecting samples and analyzing every inch of the crime scene. The results were puzzling. While they found plenty of Thomas's DNA throughout the apartment, understandable, given their affair, they also uncovered traces of someone else's DNA on Daniel's body and around the scene. It was a match for Maggie Hargrove, Thomas's wife. The discovery of Maggie's DNA at the crime scene sent shockwaves through the investigation. Moore had initially considered Maggie a concerned wife, desperate to save her marriage. But now she began to see Maggie in a different light. Moore requested a formal interview with Maggie. Unlike Thomas, Maggie was composed and controlled during her questioning. She maintained that she had no idea how her DNA ended up at Daniel's body, insisting that she was only at Daniel's apartments a couple of days ago and she just came in to talk. The time of Denial's murder did not coincide with the time when Maggie arrived. The cameras at Daniel's house did show Maggie visiting him a couple of days ago, but on the night of the murder there was no one or anything suspicious at the front door. Her demeanor was calm, almost too calm, which only heightened Moore's suspicions. The more Maggie denied any involvement, the more Moore became convinced that she was hiding something. Meanwhile, the forensic team uncovered another critical piece of evidence: Daniel's phone, hidden under a pile of clothes in his bedroom. When they analyzed the data, they found a series of texts between him and Maggie, the tone of which suggested that Maggie had been in contact with Daniel far more often than she had admitted. The messages revealed a pattern of increasing hostility, with Maggie demanding that Daniel leave Thomas alone, threatening to expose their affair to the world. You're probably wondering how Daniel was killed. According to the latest investigation, Daniel died from blood loss due to 16 knife stabs. 12 of them hit the stomach. This is a very brutal murder, so the prosecution needed clear evidence. But practically everything came down to Maggie based on circumstantial evidence. Unfortunately for the investigation, there was no direct evidence of Maggie's involvement. The murder weapon was not at the scene. It was also not found either at Maggie's house or nearby in trash bins or parks. Dogs were even involved in the search, sniffing Maggie and then trying to find the murder weapon. Maggie was detained pending clarification of the circumstances. She pleaded guilty to threatening and not loving Daniel, but she denies murder. As of August 18, 2024, the investigation is still ongoing and Maggie has been released. But the police still have a long way to go.